The best feature to Grounded is its premise. As humans, we've had a strange obsession over the years with being shrunk. And if we're not shrunk like in the film Honey, I've Shrunk the Kids, then we're comfortable anthropomorphizing small things, like A Bug's Life or Toy Story, for the benefit of seeing other small things loom large in the foreground. Grounded is a survival game where you play as a shrunk child, so every object or experience relies on reality, albeit a recontextualized one. Still, everyone understands the materials in a sandwich cookie. Everybody understands why juice from a juice box might provide both water and food due to its massive sugar content. Everybody is intuitively aware that some spiders might have a venom that might sap our life after puncturing. When looking up at the sky and seeing a flying insect, we can see rather quickly whether it is a gnat, or a mosquito, or a bee, or a wasp. This iconography of the real world matters when surviving, but in the context of a survival game, the end result is not a bleak and forlorn experience like that of the equally intuitive but terrifying experience of The Long Dark, but rather a fun, energetic, and engaging summer break with the kids in the backyard. Not only is this important for approachability, it matters also as a deep evolutionary desire. Survival games address the conservative need to get back to basics, but if we also take into account archaeological evidence, then Grounded also reintroduces a world of big monsters that, in our modern era, we have made extinct. Humans have been making animal species extinct ever since we made our debut, but they started with large animals we outsmarted. In Grounded, spiders are the size of mastodons. A blackbird roams the sky like a 747. A soldier ant might as well be a bear. Grounded subliminally returns us to a prehistoric start, but with modern, knowable conventions. Beyond this aesthetic, the most functionally interesting choices in Grounded are its item economy, its shared world, and its blueprint system. But Grounded is also held back in some ways, both specifically in its own choices, as well as in the genre it rests in. I'll speak on these points now. The item economy first. It's flexible and versatile. Items serve multiple purposes, such as the Mite Fuzz, which has double-digit uses. Many of the items have such web-like connections to items both at the top tiers of the hierarchy as well as the bottom, save for those bottleneck resources that are a sign of mastery, like the Wolf Spiderfang. Unlike survival games like Valheim, which fail to make good on old materials to the point of creating a crafting piece called the Obliterator, which gets rid of excess materials, or Minecraft, which has inundated the item economy with aesthetic variation for its own sake, Grounded's closed system feels tight and universally functional. One of the easiest places to see this is when Grounded allows the players to make upgrade materials of their own, using the parts of larvae combined with tree sap. It's these mid to late game choices that puts Grounded ahead of several other survival games because it allows a player's inventory to grow with them, not stagnate and bloat in chests. This is the minimum that any survival game should strive for. Rather than force the player to create a dedicated server with their own secondary device, Grounded utilizes Microsoft's cloud architecture to hold on to a shared world between several asynchronous players. This minor change lowers the barrier to entry into this style of game. Where before a player needs to fight their firewall and learn port forwarding, a player with Grounded need only press a few buttons. More games in this genre need this innovation, full stop. Players can collectively tweak settings to their desired playstyle and can build at their own pace, without waiting for the presence of their hosting friend. Though many games cannot hope to leverage the reach of Microsoft, it establishes a precedent that is hard to ignore. Most important in a co-op setting is lowering the friction for collaborative building. In Grounded, a player can establish a blueprint in the playspace. This does not build the structure yet, but presents a mock-up that players can invest resources to eventually finish, whereupon the blueprint disappears and the structure remains. This is such a brilliant system. I believe it's worth discussing more. First, it allows a player to place structures without investment and labor. Second, it easily divides players into roles between planners and workers. Third, players can see non-verbally what resources are needed, flattening the knowledge base between veteran and new players. Fourth, players can invest into structures gradually without needing every piece simultaneously. A hidden benefit to this point is item inventory management, where a player can store, quote-unquote, items in structures, rather than dedicated storage chests. Fifth, with the touch of a single button, a player can duplicate a blueprint already established, rather than have to navigate a menu to find a very specific piece, expediting the building of larger projects. Sixth, blueprints pull items easily from nearby storage, as well as from an inventory, expediting building even further. Given all of these benefits from the blueprint system alone, and popular building titles like Valheim fall way behind, in my opinion, a blueprint system ameliorates a lot of the friction inherent in trying to build, both alone and with a group, in this improvisational manner. Like many, perhaps all games in the survival genre, Grounded has poor combat. 2024's Enshrouded comes closest to bucking this trend, having combat that I would describe as not terrible. Then again, Enshrouded is the game with the least amount of survival genre features, so we could perhaps place these games on a continuum, and there we would find the poor combat would only get worse the further along we would travel along the spectrum. Grounded's combat suffers from being sluggish, awkward, and spongy. It becomes clear to the player that the game forces you to rely on blocking, as outrunning or dodging using the aphid slippers or natural explorer mutation proves meaningless. When a player enters a combat phase, for some bizarre reason, the natural explorer mutation is switched off. This is likely to prevent overcommitting to any action by a much faster and more unwieldy player, but it frustrated me that an entire playstyle of hit and run, or fire and maneuver, was removed. Enemies like ladybugs, or roly-polies, or bombardiers can easily be cheesed using thistle branches, where combining this with the spiky sprig weapon can cause bleeding over time, so a player may swing and hit an enemy and then run. And yet, another problem the player runs into with this particular strategy is the game's poor memory. If a player runs too far away, the world resets, and suddenly that enemy you were fighting has all of its health back, causing such frustrating dissonance for me on several occasions. Grounded wants it both ways. It wants to recreate the prehistoric feeling of facing large enemies, but it wants you to do so on modern gaming terms, which is likely not how our ancestor human beings defeated these animals in the first place. We outsmarted them, and Grounded is not interested in outsmarting. Lower enemies end up brute forced, while higher enemies end up avoided, at least to an extent. Mosquitoes have my vote for the most annoying enemy in Grounded, as their remarkably high health seems contradictory to a mosquito's fragile nature, and yet they swoop in and give out a 3-hit combo that can nearly destroy a player's entire health pool, despite supposed upgrades in equipment. Survival games often fail or flourish not in the early or late game, but in its mid-game, and Grounded's mid-game is an unhealthy combination of avoidance, spam, cheese, and tedium, none of which feels necessarily rewarding. Grounded chooses mostly a progression model for its weapons and armor, similar to Valheim, rather than a trade-off system, with some caveats, like for example the antlion armor, which provides protection specifically from heat. Other pieces of equipment provide similar benefits, but they are minimal. For solo players in Grounded, the best upgrade as usual to these sorts of problems is not to pick up more armor or better weapons, not to load up on health restoratives, but to find a second, third, and fourth player. Like most other games, the enemies are designed with large health to tank multiple players, but not designed in their behavior. While the aesthetic design of the world feels stylistic and approachable, it lacks verticality in much of the early game. Even then, much of the later parts of Grounded take place on higher terraces, but still find themselves surrounded by grass, constant forests of grass, which becomes both monotonous and claustrophobic. Not only that, it makes fights with certain larger enemies in grass hellish and awkward, as who knows how the AI will respond to all these static objects. Part of me suspects that this choice of so much grass was to handle the loading in and calling of assets, as to avoid pop-in on minimum hardware, like the Xbox Series S. This biome monotony of a backyard is diversified by making this backyard the dirtiest and messiest one I've ever seen. For those players in foreign countries, trust me, not all American gardens are like this. A player is constantly exposed to new objects like wedding rings, quarters, and baseballs, objects that help the player orient themselves in the midst of all this grass. But even these objects cannot stem the tide of monotony that comes from retreading old ground. Another problem with the world design has little to do with orientation per se, but with the design of certain biome entrances. Again, I am not sure why it needed to be this way. Perhaps when Grounded loads in its particular chunks for the player, it operates much like the annoying feature of elevators or ravines in third-person narrative action games, where the game knows the player has entered a certain location and will therefore not need the rest of the map. It's not always like this. For the fish pond, which is approachable from any shore, that location works just fine. But later locations typically have far fewer entrances, and are also farther away, and therefore a player must navigate through several locations with bees, or mosquitoes, or a string of other enemies. So unless a player is willing to build larger bases in each quadrant of the map, you can expect to have to make this gauntlet over and over again ad nauseum. Until a group of players can organize a series of zipline fast travel shortcuts, they can expect to retread old ground exhaustively, which is why the mutation Natural Explorer and the Aphid Slippers are pretty much mandatory to make travel less repetitious. Taken in holistic terms, however, and Grounded comes out in the black. Grounded, like some of the best survival games, takes the collaborative energy from a massively multiplayer online role-playing game and renders it in a smaller package, and does so spatially using structures and progression. In both the front end and the back end, it succeeds, the front end being its approachable style and its removal of friction in the back. Still, however, it is also plagued in some unsurprising ways that the survival genre may never rid itself of for quite some time. As far as a novice player's first survival game, I believe Enshrouded or Minecraft to be a better choice, as Grounded fools players into thinking it's a fun and leisurely summer experience. But as a first entry into survival games for a veteran video game player, you could do far worse than Grounded, especially if you have friends. Thanks for watching.